December 24th, 1144. Edessa's defenders are on the walls when the stone beneath their feet suddenly shudders, not from a battering ram, but from something underground. A moment later, the unbreakable wall doesn't crack like a door. It drops, collapsing into a hidden void. Dust erupts. The breach opens wide enough for an army, and the city's greatest defense has just turned into the attacker's weapon, because the enemy wasn't outside the gates. They were already digging beneath them. But let's back up. Because what happened under Edessa's walls? That's not just a siege story. That's an engineering thriller where the battlefield moved underground, where patience beat strength, and where the impossible became inevitable. In the next few minutes, you'll see how a fortress that should have held for months fell in weeks. You'll see the simple trick, wood, fire, and gravity, that turned walls into weapons. And you'll see why the defenders, standing on 30 feet of solid stone, never saw it coming. The year is 1144. The Crusader states are islands in a hostile sea: Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, and Edessa, the northernmost, the most exposed, the first conquest of the First Crusade. Edessa isn't just another castle, it's a statement. Roman-era foundations, medieval upgrades, walls thick enough to laugh at battering rams, towers positioned so archers can cover every approach, gates that funnel attackers into kill zones. You want to take this city? Start planning for a year-long siege. Bring thousands of men, except that most of them won't go home. This is the kind of fortress that breaks armies. Attackers smash themselves against it like waves on rocks, and the rocks don't even notice. At least that's the theory. But here's what nobody's thinking about. Walls don't just sit on top of the ground. They go into it. Their foundations reach down into earth and bedrock, and all that weight, thousands upon thousands of tons, presses down, down, down. What happens when... What's down there? Isn't there anymore? November 1144. The worst possible time for a crisis. Count Jocelyn II of Edessa makes a decision that will haunt historians for centuries. He takes the bulk of his garrison, the trained soldiers, the experienced fighters, the men who know these walls, and marches them west of the Euphrates. Why? Disputes, politics, the usual medieval mess of conflicting interests and territorial squabbles. The gates close behind his army. The walls are now manned by skeleton crews, militias, whoever's left, and someone is watching. Imad al-Din Zengi, Atabeg of Mosul and Aleppo. If you're imagining some reckless warlord who charges at walls screaming, erase that image. Zengi is calculating, patient, the kind of commander who doesn't create opportunities. He waits for them and then moves like lightning when they appear. He's been watching Edessa for years, probing, testing, waiting for the moment. And Jocelyn just gave it to him. The moment the Crusader army marches away, Zengi moves. Fast. He doesn't send heralds, doesn't make demands. He just appears outside Edessa with an army, and by the time anyone can react, the siege has already begun. November 28th, 1144. The siege begins. Inside the city, the defenders do the math. They're outnumbered, undermanned. Their count is gone. Their main army is gone. But they have the walls, and walls have held before. Messengers gallop toward Jerusalem, toward Antioch, toward anyone who might help. The message is desperate. Edessa is besieged. Send help, now. In Jerusalem, Queen Melisende receives the news. She's one of the most powerful rulers in the Crusader states, and she immediately starts organizing relief. Letters go out, orders are given, an army will march, but every lord in the Crusader states has to protect his own territory first. Everyone has enemies. Everyone needs time to muster troops, gather supplies, plan the march. Help is coming, just not yet. Days pass, then a week, then 2. Every morning, the defenders scan the horizon, looking for dust clouds, for the glint of armor, for banners, Every morning, nothing. And every day, Zengi's army digs. At first it looks conventional. Zengi sets up trebuchets, giant siege engines that can hurl stones the size of a man's torso. They're terrifying weapons. When they hit like the fist of God. The bombardment begins. Crack. A stone smashes into the wall near the Gate of the Hours. Chips fly. Dust rises. The wall holds. Crack. Another hit. Another cloud of pulverized stone. The wall holds. This is what these walls were built for. Yes, they're taking damage. Yes, cracks are appearing. But breaking through 30 feet of stone? That takes time. Months, maybe. And Zengi doesn't have months. He has weeks before Jocelyn returns. Weeks before that relief army from Jerusalem arrives. Weeks before this siege turns from an opportunity into a trap. So he makes a choice that separates good commanders from legendary ones. If the wall won't open, remove what's holding it up. Think about it. That wall weighs more than you can imagine. Thousands of tons pressing down on foundations, on packed earth, on bedrock. It's been standing there for centuries because everything beneath it is solid. But what if it wasn't? What if you could turn the ground beneath the wall into empty air? The trebuchets keep firing. They have to. The defenders need to believe that's the real attack, that the danger is coming from outside, from above, from what they can see. But the real attack? That's already begun underground. Here's how you destroy the impossible. Step 1. You don't run at the wall. That's suicide. Defenders on 30-foot walls with crossbows will turn your army into a graveyard before you get within 50 feet. Instead, you dig toward it. Approach trenches. That's what siege engineers call them. Zigzagging ditches that snake toward your target, deep enough that a man can walk upright without becoming target practice. You cover them with timber and dirt. From above, they look like scars in the earth, but inside? Inside, men can move. Supplies can flow. The approach is slow, methodical, protected. The defenders watch these trenches creeping closer. Day by day, meter by meter. They fire arrows down, but the trenches are covered. They drop stones, but the angles are wrong. The trenches just keep coming. And then they stop. Right at the base of the wall, the defenders breathe easier. The trenches have reached their limit. What can Zengi do now? The wall is still there. Still massive, still unbreakable. That's when the real work begins. At the end of the trench, where it kisses the wall's foundation, miners start digging down. Not through the wall. That would take forever. Not over it. That's impossible. Under it. The tunnel entrance is narrow, just wide enough for a man with a pickaxe. The miners work in shifts because the air down there is thick, hot, suffocating. No light except torches. No sound except the ring of metal on stone, on clay, on whatever's holding up thousands of tons of wall. They're not trying to get inside the city. That's not the goal. They're trying to remove the ground beneath the wall's foundation. Think of it like this. You've got a table, 4 legs, solid. Now imagine someone crawls underneath and starts sawing through the legs, one by one. The table's still standing, for now. But it's not resting on the floor anymore. It's resting on what's left of those legs. That's what's happening under Edessa's walls. The miners hollow out a chamber, then another. Then they connect them. They're creating a cave system directly beneath the foundation, removing the earth and stone that's been supporting the wall since before the Crusades even existed. But here's the thing. You can't just remove that support. Not yet. Because if you do, the wall drops immediately. And you, the miner, 20 feet underground in a tunnel the width of a coffin. You get crushed, buried alive, entombed in the very victory you just created. So you hold the wall up, with wood. The miners bring down timber, thick posts, support beams. They construct what looks like an underground forest, hundreds of wooden pillars taking the weight of the wall. The stone groans above them. The posts creak. The whole thing feels like it's breathing, like the earth itself is alive and angry. but it holds. The wall is now resting on wood instead of earth. The defenders above have no idea. They're watching the trebuchets, watching the trenches, watching the horizon for relief forces. They're not watching what's beneath their boots. Days pass. The mining continues. The chamber grows. More posts go in. More weight transfers to timber. And then the miners pack the entire space with fuel, straw, kindling, branches, anything that burns. They stack it around every post, stuff it into every gap. The underground chamber becomes a massive tinderbox, just waiting for a spark. December 23rd, 1144. The mining is complete. The trap is set. Everything is ready. The miners withdraw. One by one, they crawl back through the tunnel, back through the trench, back to safety. The last man out carries a torch. And then they light it. Now imagine you're a defender on that wall. It's winter. Cold. You've been on watch for hours, scanning for an attack that keeps not coming. The trebuchets have gone quiet. That's strange, but maybe they're repositioning. Maybe they're running out of stones. You stamp your feet to stay warm. You think about the relief army. It has to be close now, has to be. And then you feel it. Not a sound. Not at first. Just a vibration. Like the stone beneath you is humming. You freeze. What was that? The man next to you feels it too. You both look down. The vibration becomes a tremor. The tremor becomes a rumble. And then the world drops. Because 20 feet below, the posts are burning. The fire spreads fast. It's been designed to spread fast. Flames lick up the wooden pillars. The posts start to char, to crack, to weaken. The walls wait. Those thousands of tons starts to win. One post fails, then another, then 5 more, then 20. The supports collapse like dominoes. The tunnel ceiling caves in, and the wall, that impossible wall, that Roman-era 30-foot-thick symbol of Crusader power, it drops, not toppling outward like a felled tree, not cracking like a broken door, dropping, straight down, into the void that's been carved beneath it. The sound is apocalyptic. Imagine every thunderstorm you've ever heard compressed into 3 seconds. Stone grinding on stone, the roar of collapsing earth, the shriek of metal, hinges, gates, reinforcements, all tearing apart at once. Dust erupts like a volcanic cloud. It blocks out the sun. For a moment, nobody can see anything. Not the defenders, not the attackers. Just brown-gray chaos. And when the dust begins to settle, the wall is gone. Not damaged, not cracked. Gone. In its place, a ramp of rubble, broken stone, shattered foundation, a breach more than 100 cubits wide, roughly 150 feet, wide enough for 100 men to charge through side by side. The defenders on top of that section? Dead. Crushed, buried in the collapse. The ones on the adjacent section stare in disbelief. How? How is that possible? But there's no time to process, no time to understand, because Zengi's army is already moving. The assault doesn't wait, can't wait. Surprise is an asset that expires in seconds. The signal goes up, and thousands of soldiers pour out of the trenches, out of the siege camps, converging on that breach like water finding a crack in a dam. They don't use ladders, don't use siege towers, don't ram the gates. They run up the rubble. The wall itself has become their ladder, their ram, their way in. The defenders try to respond. Archers fire into the oncoming wave. Militiamen rush towards the breach with whatever weapons they have. But they're outnumbered, disorganized, and still reeling from the impossible thing that just happened. How do you fight an enemy who's already inside before you knew the walls were gone? The fighting in the breach is chaos, desperate, close-quarters brutality where nobody has room to swing a sword properly, where men are just shoving, stabbing, trying to hold ground they're already losing. The defenders fall back, street by street, house by house. Some make it to the citadel, the last fortified point in the city. They bar the doors. Maybe they can hold there. Maybe relief will still come. It won't. December 24th, 1144, Christmas Eve. Edessa, the first city conquered in the First Crusade, falls. The news will take weeks to reach Jerusalem, months to reach Europe, and when it does, it will send shockwaves through Christendom. The unbreakable city, broken, not by superior numbers, not by longer siege, but by something nobody saw coming, because the enemy wasn't at the gates, they were under them. But let's pause here. Because you might be wondering, why didn't the defenders stop this? They had weeks. They knew Zengi's army was out there. They could hear the digging, faint, muffled, but there, like the earth had developed a pulse. So why didn't they do anything? The answer is, they tried, or at least they should have. There's a counter to underground mining. It's called counter mining, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You dig your own tunnels toward the enemy's tunnels. You find them before they find you. You break through into their workspace and collapse their operation. Sometimes you flood them. Sometimes you fight them. Hand-to-hand combat in pitch-black tunnels where you can't see the man trying to kill you. Medieval siege warfare had examples of this. Defenders who heard mining operations and responded by digging back. Underground battles that never made it into the history books because nobody survived to write them down. So why didn't Edessa countermine effectively? 3 reasons. First, they were undermanned. Jocelyn had taken the garrison. The people left inside weren't professional soldiers. They were militias, merchants, citizens who knew how to hold a spear, but not how to direct a countermining operation. You need experienced engineers for that. People who understand soil composition, who can track sound through earth, who know where to dig. Edessa didn't have them. Second, the towers were understaffed. Historical records tell us that many defensive positions weren't fully manned. When you spread a skeleton crew across miles of walls, gaps appear, blind spots, places where nobody's watching quite carefully enough. Zengi's engineers picked their spot carefully, probably scouted for weeks beforehand, found the section where the watch was thinnest, where the response would be slowest. Third, and this is the psychological part, nobody really believed it would work. Think about it from the defenders' perspective. You're standing on 30 feet of solid stone, walls that have stood for centuries. You hear digging. Okay. So what? They're digging. Let them dig. It'll take them months to make any real progress, and by then relief will have arrived. Jocelyn will return. The siege will break. You're not worried about what's underneath because what's underneath has always been solid, reliable, the foundation of foundations. Until it's not. That's the genius of Zengi's approach. It weaponizes confidence. The defenders' faith in their walls becomes a blindfold. They can't imagine the impossible, so they don't prepare for it. And by the time they realize what's happening, the ground is already shaking. Now here's what makes this even more brutal. The defenders on that section of wall probably had seconds of warning. Maybe they felt the first tremors. Maybe they saw cracks appearing in the stone beneath their feet. Maybe they tried to run. But there's nowhere to run when the ground disappears. One moment you're standing on the most secure structure in the region. The next, you're falling through empty air with several tons of stone following you down. The archaeological reality is grim. When walls collapse inward like this, they don't leave bodies on top. They bury them completely. Those defenders weren't killed in battle. They were entombed, crushed under the very fortifications they were supposed to be protected by. And the survivors inside the city? They didn't just face an attacking army. They faced the psychological shock of watching their greatest asset become their greatest liability in 3 seconds. Imagine being a citizen of Edessa that morning. You've spent weeks watching those walls, drawing comfort from them, thinking, we can hold. The walls will protect us. and then the walls just stop existing. That's not just a military defeat. That's reality breaking. That's the moment when everything you thought was solid turns out to be built on nothing. The assault through the breach isn't a clean military operation. It's chaos. Zengi's forces pour through, but they're not executing some careful plan. They're flooding into a city that's still reeling from catastrophe. Some defenders fight. Some run. Some just stand there, frozen, trying to process what happened. The streets near the Gate of the Hours become a nightmare. Fighting in urban terrain is always messy. Narrow alleys, buildings providing cover, civilians caught in the middle. Add in the dust cloud from the collapse, the confusion, the sheer disbelief, and you have a battle that's less organized warfare and more controlled apocalypse. The defenders fall back towards the citadel. It's their only option. The citadel is fortified separately from the main walls, a fortress within the fortress. If they can reach it, bar the gates, they might be able to hold out, might be able to wait for relief. Some make it, not many. The citadel gates slam shut. Inside, a few, 100 survivors. Outside, Zengi's army, already spreading through the city. And that's when the worst part begins. Because sieges don't end with the fighting. They end with what happens after. Now, historical accounts of what happened next vary. Some sources say Zengi tried to maintain order. Others suggest his army, sensing victory, got out of control. The truth is probably somewhere in between. Medieval armies didn't have the discipline of modern forces. When a city fell, especially after resistance, soldiers expected compensation. What we know for certain, there was looting. There was violence against civilians. The sources from both sides agree on that, even if they disagree on the scale. The citadel held for a while. Days, maybe. But without relief, without supplies, without hope, it was only a matter of time. When it finally surrendered, Edessa, the first conquest of the First Crusade, the northern shield of the Crusader states, was gone. 46 years of Christian rule, ended by wood, fire, and gravity. December 26, 1144, 2 days after the wall fell. The citadel surrenders. Zengi's victory is complete. But here's what nobody at Edessa knew. The real impact of this siege wasn't going to be military. It was going to be psychological, political, religious. Because when news of Edessa's fall reached Europe, it didn't just shock people, it terrified them. The First Crusade had been sold as a divine mission. God was on their side. They'd reclaimed Jerusalem, established kingdoms, built fortresses. They were supposed to be there forever, backed by heaven itself. And now one of those eternal cities had fallen. Not to some massive army, not after years of siege, but in weeks, to an enemy who fought underground like demons in medieval imagination. The propaganda practically wrote itself. Pope Eugenius III received the news and immediately began calling for a new crusade. The Second Crusade. Kings would march, armies would gather. Europe would pour resources into retaking what had been lost. But here's the thing about crusades. They're expensive, slow, political. By the time the Second Crusade actually got organized and marched east, Zengi was dead, assassinated by one of his own servants in 1146, and his son Nur ad-Din had consolidated control. The Second Crusade would ultimately fail to retake Edessa. In fact, it would accomplish almost nothing except draining treasuries and getting thousands of people killed. But that's a different story. Let's zoom out. Because the fall of Edessa isn't just about one siege, it's about a fundamental shift in how warfare worked. For thousands of years, walls meant safety. You build them high enough, thick enough, and you're protected. Cities invested everything in fortifications because fortifications worked. An army could smash itself against good walls for months and achieve nothing but casualties. But Edessa proved something terrifying. Walls are only as strong as what's beneath them. And that changed everything. After LM-44, every fortress commander in the medieval world had to think differently. It wasn't enough to watch the horizon for armies. You had to listen to the ground. You had to assume that any siege might include mining operations. You had to train people in countermining, stock timber for counter-tunnels, post guards who could recognize the sound of digging through 20 feet of earth. Siege warfare had moved underground. And once that knowledge spread, it became an arms race. Attackers got better at mining. Defenders got better at countermining. Tunnels met counter-tunnels in underground battles that were absolutely nightmarish, fighting in spaces so tight you couldn't swing a sword, so dark you couldn't see your own hand, with the constant fear that the ceiling might collapse and bury everyone. Some sieges became more about what was happening below ground than above it. Miners versus miners, engineers versus engineers. The surface, war became a distraction for the real battle happening in the darkness underneath. But here's what makes Edessa special. Zengi didn't invent siege mining. That technique was ancient. Romans did it. Persians did it. The technology had been around for over 1,000 years. What made Edessa remarkable was the execution, the timing, the circumstances. Zengi had a window of maybe 4 weeks, between Jocelyn leaving and relief arriving. Most sieges took months, years even. But Zengi's engineers worked fast enough, smart enough, to pull off a complex underground operation in the time most commanders would still be setting up camp. That's not just engineering, that's operational genius. Think about what had to happen simultaneously. The trebuchets had to keep firing to maintain the illusion of a conventional siege. The approach trenches had to be dug without getting massacred by defenders. The mining had to proceed quickly, but quietly enough not to trigger effective countermining. This timing of the collapse had to be coordinated with assault forces ready to exploit the breach immediately. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the whole plan fails. The tunnel collapses too early and kills your own miners. The defenders detect the operation and countermine successfully. The assault forces aren't ready when the wall falls, and the defenders have time to regroup. Zengi got all of it right. But let's talk about the human cost. Because history tends to focus on tactics and strategy, and it's easy to forget that real people died here. The miners who dug those tunnels? They worked in conditions that would violate every modern safety regulation ever written. Cramped spaces, bad air, the constant risk of collapse. Some of them definitely died during the operation. That's just the reality of underground work with medieval technology. The defenders on the wall when it collapsed? Gone, buried. No chance to fight, no chance to run, just crushing weight and darkness. The fourth civilians inside Edessa? Caught between armies. Medieval warfare wasn't clean, wasn't discriminating. When a city fell after resistance, civilians suffered. The sources don't give us exact numbers, but they give us enough to know. It was bad. And for what? For Zengi, it was about power, consolidating control, pushing back against Crusader expansion, proving that the Crusader states weren't invincible. For Jocelyn, it was a catastrophic failure of judgment. He gambled that Edessa could spare its garrison for a few weeks. He lost. For the people of Edessa, Christian, Muslim, Armenian, all the communities that called the city home, it was a disaster that came out of nowhere and destroyed everything. That's the brutal arithmetic of medieval warfare. Brilliant tactics, strategic genius, and underneath it all, human suffering on a scale we can barely imagine. Now, here's a question worth asking. Could Edessa have been saved? Yes, absolutely yes. If Jocelyn hadn't taken the garrison away, the city would have had the manpower to countermine effectively, to detect the operation early, to make Zengi's task so difficult and time-consuming that he'd have to abandon the siege when relief forces approached. If the relief army from Jerusalem had moved faster, if the Crusader states had been more unified, less fractured by internal politics, help might have arrived before the wall fell. If the defenders had taken the underground threat more seriously, posted more guards, listened more carefully. If. History is full of ifs, moments where one different decision could have changed everything. But here's the thing about siege warfare. It's not forgiving. There's no room for error. One mistake, one underestimated threat, and centuries of fortification become rubble in seconds. Edessa made that mistake, and paid for it. Let's talk about Zengi for a moment, because he doesn't get to enjoy his victory for long. 2 years after Edessa, Zengi is assassinated by one of his own servants. Accounts vary on why. Revenge for some personal slight. A conspiracy. Medieval sources aren't always reliable on details like this, but his legacy? That survives. His son, Nur ad-Din, inherits his territories and continues the push against the Crusader states. Nur ad-Din's protege will be a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din, better known to history as Saladin, the man who will eventually recapture Jerusalem in 1187. You can draw a direct line from the fall of Edessa to the fall of Jerusalem. Zengi's victory proved the Crusader states were vulnerable. It inspired a generation of Muslim leaders to believe that reconquest was possible. It shifted momentum. One siege, one collapsed wall, ripples that spread across decades. And the Crusader states? They never really recovered. Edessa was never retaken. The Second Crusade's failure damaged European enthusiasm for crusading. Resources dried up. Support weakened. The Kingdom of Jerusalem would limp along for another century, but the writing was on the wall, or rather, in the rubble where the wall used to be. The age of Crusader expansion was over. The age of contraction had begun. All because someone figured out how to weaponize gravity. So, what's the lesson here? What does a medieval siege from 880 years ago teach us? First, fortifications are only as strong as their foundations. It doesn't matter how thick your walls are, how high your towers stand, how many soldiers you have on the battlements. If the ground beneath you isn't solid, none of it matters. That's true in warfare. It's true in engineering. It's true in life. The defenders of Edessa stood on 30 feet of stone and felt invincible. They were standing on nothing and didn't know it. Second, assumptions kill. The defenders assumed their walls were unbreakable because they'd always been unbreakable. They assumed they had time because sieges always took time. They assumed help would come because help had always come before. Every single assumption was wrong. And here's the terrifying part. They weren't stupid assumptions. They were reasonable, based on experience, based on centuries of evidence, based on how siege warfare had always worked. But warfare evolves. And the moment you stop questioning your defenses, the moment you become confident in your invincibility, that's when you're most vulnerable. Edessa's defenders made the same mistake fortress commanders have made throughout history. They prepared for the last war, not the next one. Third, innovation wins wars. Zengi didn't have a bigger army, didn't have better weapons, didn't have superior numbers or some supernatural advantage. He had engineers who understood physics, patience to let them work, and the operational discipline to coordinate a complex plan under impossible time pressure. Medieval warfare wasn't just about hitting things harder, it was about hitting things smarter. Think about what Zengi's victory required. Expertise in soil, composition, structural engineering, timing, coordination between surface operations and underground work, psychological warfare to keep defenders focused on the wrong threat. That's not brute force. That's sophisticated, multi-layered strategic thinking. And it worked because his enemies weren't prepared for sophistication. They were prepared for armies, for battering rams, for long sieges, for conventional warfare. Fourth, and this is the big one, the battlefield isn't always where you think it is. The defenders of Edessa were watching the trebuchets, watching the trenches, watching the horizon for relief forces. They were fighting the visible war, the war they could see, the war that made sense. Meanwhile, the real war was happening 20 feet underground, in darkness, in silence, in a place they couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't defend. That's the nightmare scenario for any defender. The enemy isn't where you're looking. They're in your blind spot, working away while you stare at decoys and distractions. And by the time you realize where the real threat is, the ground is already shaking. Modern military strategists still study this principle. Asymmetric warfare, attacking where the enemy isn't prepared, finding the weakness in systems that seem impenetrable, turning an enemy's strength, their confidence, their assumptions, their very defenses against them. Edessa's walls weren't weak, they were magnificent, impressive, everything a fortress should be. But someone found the one place they were vulnerable, the foundation, and exploited it perfectly. Now let's bring this back to that moment. December 24th, 1144, Christmas Eve. Imagine you're in Europe, France maybe, England, Germany. It's winter, cold. You're celebrating the holiday with your family, going to church, thinking about the Holy Land, sure, but it's distant, abstract, someone else's war. And somewhere, moving slowly along trade routes and messenger networks, news is traveling. News that will reach you in weeks, months maybe. News that one of Christianity's great fortress cities has fallen. That Edessa, the first conquest of the First Crusade, the northernmost shield of the Crusader states, is gone. Not after a heroic last stand. Not after months of desperate resistance. Not after some epic battle that'll become a legend. But suddenly, impossibly, the walls just dropped. When that news arrives, it won't feel real. It'll feel like a nightmare, like someone describing something that shouldn't be possible. Because that's what Edessa was. Impossible. Right up until the moment it happened. Pope Eugenius III receives the news and immediately understands. This isn't just a military defeat. This is a psychological catastrophe. The Crusader states were supposed to be permanent, blessed by God, protected by heaven itself. If Edessa can fall, if those walls can just disappear, then nothing is safe. Not Antioch, not Tripoli, maybe not even Jerusalem. He calls for a new crusade, the Second Crusade. Kings will march. Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential figures in medieval Christianity, will preach it. Thousands will take up the cross, and it will fail, spectacularly, because crusades are slow, political, expensive. By the time the Second Crusade actually gets organized and marches east, years have passed. Zengi is dead, assassinated by his own servant in 1146. His son Nur ad-Din has consolidated control and is stronger than his father ever was. The Crusaders will besiege Damascus in 1148. It'll be a disaster. They'll retreat, accomplish nothing, return home humiliated. Edessa will never be retaken. But the ripples keep spreading. Nur ad-Din continues his father's work. He'll mentor a Kurdish general named Salah ad-Din. You know him as Saladin, the man who will recapture Jerusalem in 1187, 43 years after Edessa falls. You can draw a direct line from Zengi's engineers lighting those support posts on fire to Saladin standing in the Dome of the Rock, victorious. One siege, one collapsed wall, one moment of engineering brilliance, ripples that spread across decades and change the course of history. The Crusader states never recover their momentum. Edessa's fall proves they're vulnerable. It inspires a generation of Muslim leaders to believe reconquest is possible. it shifts the entire strategic balance. The Kingdom of Jerusalem limps along for another century, but the writing is on the wall, or rather, in the rubble where the wall used to be. The age of Crusader expansion is over. The age of contraction has begun, all because someone figured out how to weaponize gravity. So here's the final question. Why does this story matter now? Why should you care about a medieval siege from 880 years ago? Because the principle hasn't changed. The technology is different. We're not digging tunnels with pickaxes and burning wooden posts anymore. But the core idea remains absolutely relevant. Every system has a foundation. Every defense has an assumption. Every fortress has a weakness. Find it, exploit it. Win. That's what Zengi did in 1144. That's what attackers have been doing ever since. And that's what defenders have been trying to prevent, with varying degrees of success, for the last 9 centuries. In cybersecurity, they call it finding the vulnerability. In business, it's disrupting the market. In warfare, it's asymmetric tactics, same principle, different battlefield. Edessa fell because someone looked at an impossible problem. How do you break through walls that can't be broken? And asked a different question entirely. What if we don't break through them? What if we don't fight them at all? What if we make them break themselves? The answer killed a city, changed a war, sparked a crusade, rewrote history, and proved that in warfare, as in life, the most dangerous threats aren't the ones you can see coming. They're not the armies on the horizon or the trebuchets hurling stones or the obvious, visible dangers you're watching for. They're the ones already beneath your feet, working silently, patiently, removing the ground you're standing on one shovelful at a time, and you don't know it's happening until the world drops. December 24th, 1144. The day gravity became a weapon. The day fortresses learned to fear their foundations. The day Edessa's defenders discovered that standing on solid stone means nothing if the stone isn't standing on anything. One collapsed wall. One engineering miracle. One moment that changed everything. Because in the end, Edessa didn't lose because its walls were weak. It lost because someone learned how to weaponize what held them up. And when the support disappeared, when those wooden posts burned through and the tunnel ceiling caved in and the foundation dropped into empty air, so did the city. That's not just a siege story. That's a lesson carved in stone and written in fire. A reminder that strength without awareness is just a bigger target. That defenses without adaptability are just temporary obstacles. That yesterday's invincibility is tomorrow's rubble. The walls were built to stop armies. But in 1144, the walls became the weapon that killed Edessa. And somewhere, in the darkness 20 feet underground, an engineer smiled. Because he'd just proven that you don't need to be stronger than a fortress. You just need to understand what holds it up. And then remove it.